Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Norman Bacal, who started as a junior tax lawyer in a Canadian law firm a number of years ago and rose to become the leader of one of the largest firms in Canada. And his particular interest and area of practice was entertainment law. So he became very involved in the financing of movies all over Canada and in Hollywood too. He was involved, for example, in the Hunger Games trilogy and many other successful movies. But we are not talking about that too much. We are really talking about his second act as a novelist and his book Odell's Fall, the fascinating story based on the Shakespearean tragedy of Othello. I think you're going to find as fascinating as I did the story of how Norman came to be a writer, his process, the story of this book itself, and how being a lawyer actually prepared him in some pretty surprising ways for a career in creative writing and novel writing. A really fun conversation with Norman Bacal. I think you'll enjoy. Stay tuned. I am reading a really fun new book, a legal thriller called Odell's Fall. And it's my pleasure to welcome on today's episode the author of the book, Norman Bacal. Norman, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Oh, Aaron, it's a privilege to be here. Nice talking to you.
We are taking all precautions. We are working remotely. We're recording remotely, so everybody is safe. And I thought it would be nice as a change from some of the more serious topics that we take on this program to, as we sometimes do, have a conversation with a lawyer who's doing something other than the law per se. In this case, following in the great tradition of lawyers turned novelists like Scott Turow and John Grisham and others. Norman, this is, as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm halfway through the book and I'm fully gripped in this very suspenseful story that you're going to tell us about. But before we do, I have extracted from you a promise that you will not spoil the ending at all for me or our listeners. Tell us a little bit about yourself, because this not only do you have a fascinating background prior to becoming a novelist, but I think there are things about your background that will have given you some of the raw materials for this story and some of the other writing that you've done.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I think I'd start by saying my entire career has been improbable. The only thing I knew for sure when I was in law school was that I wanted to be a tax lawyer.
Oh my goodness! How did you?
Which pretty much puts the nerd sign right on my head.
Right.
So everything that followed is in some respects completely mystifying. Mostly because everyone has their preconceived notions about tax attorneys. But that's how I started, and as luck would have it, the work that I had as a young lawyer was at the bottom of the totem pole in a very small firm, and small in those days was about 18 or 19 lawyers, and they had a couple of film company clients, and it was the early days of the Canadian industry. This goes back to the early 1980s. So every legal question ended up on my desk. And within about 4 or 5 years, I became the Canadian expert on the subject of film and television in Canada.
And where in Canada? Are you in Toronto, Norman?
I started in Montreal. I moved to Toronto in 1989. And that started the second stage of my career, because basically when I left a small regional firm in Montreal to open the Toronto office, I was all of 33, just turned 33 at the time. And it looked like only golden prospects ahead. And it was an improbable venture, and ultimately, I spent most of my career financing movies and television shows, first for Canadian studios, and then eventually sort of graduated my way up the ranks and started doing work for a number of U.S. studios. So I met some very few actors. Unfortunately, I don't have very many actor stories other than Donald Sutherland, who was a client of mine for about 30 years.
His wife just passed away. His wife died just, I think, yesterday or the day before.
Very, very sad. They were so in love. It was a beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
And but he happens to be Canadian, so that's how we connected.
Right.
But literally, he started with me when I was probably a second-year lawyer. Always treated me with way more respect than I deserved. Mm. And eventually, my crowning life moment was when we had lunch together at the Four Seasons in Toronto. His son Rossif, who was also an actor, lesser known than Kiefer, and myself, and we just shared stories for a few hours. And I was busy telling the son, how Donald was one of my early mentors. Very nice guy. But I strayed. So I ended up building an office out of Toronto, and our firm went from being a small 20-lawyer firm to, at its height, about 600 lawyers.
Wow.
I ended up running the firm. That was another thing I was sure I could never do. I never really expected I had any managerial or leadership talent. But we built it into a national and an international brand with offices across Canada. We had a Beverly Hills office for 10 years. Mm-hmm. The only Canadian firm to ever be able to say that. So I had a sort of a wonderful career run. And after I retired from management, the firm very sadly collapsed. And but that, it was an awful thing to go through when you spend your entire adult life not only working at a place but helping to build it, and then you suddenly watch and it's all gone, and you start questioning your very existence.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like losing somebody very, very close to you.
Yeah.
And the way I coped was by sitting and writing all my life stories as a lawyer. And that eventually, and again, it probably became my first book, which was called Breakdown. It became a Canadian bestseller, sold a few copies in the States, and it's largely a story about coming of age of a law student who eventually became a partner in a firm, how you build an organization, and how you break an organization. So kind of a triple case study. Has done very well in Canada, but it got me writing and got me obsessed about writing every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my wife who came to me and said, maybe you have a fiction book in you. And of course, I told her there was no way. I didn't believe I had the creativity to do that. And but I did have the obsession, so I decided to give it a shot. And I read some Shakespeare at Sharon's suggestion, and walked in one day and I said, I've got it. I'm going to write Othello the M&A lawyer. And so that's what I set about doing.
That's great. Well, and I have a bunch of questions.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I have a bunch of questions about that too. I mean, I've been a writer at different points in my life too, and I've always been so had such respect for writers and the writing process. So I have a lot of questions about that. But I mean, it's fascinating that a Canadian firm rose to the heights it did, built on an entertainment practice. Because I think probably most Americans would say, the beating heart of the certainly the movie industry is in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. How did you? I mean, is it because many films were being made in Canada, or was it connections that you built up through your work? How did a Canadian firm becomes so uh, successful in an industry that doesn't seem to, at least many people, I would think, have much to do with Canada.
It's interesting. When I started, the entertainment practice was sort of a footnote to the firm. We were a management side labor firm. We had a litigation group, a sort of classic commercial law firm. So business group, management side labor group, and an entertainment group, and a litigation group. That was the firm originally, and we grew up out of those roots. So the entertainment practice, although I have to say, as the industry built, it was a lot of. We came up with some tax schemes that caused virtually every U.S. studio, and this is the period probably between 1996 and 2001, the end of 2001, for about a 6-year period, every major American studio was trying to figure out how to shoot their what otherwise would have been U.S. or other foreign movies in Canada, because the tax incentives were so good, and we capitalized that and helped build the firm. By 2001, I think entertainment related revenues represented about 10% of the firm, and which I considered that to be actually a bad thing. And we set out, from 2000 through 2012, really to diversify. So we went into mining, because and oil and gas, where in a country where natural resources are everything,
right.
But where we were 15 or 20 years behind the curve. We went into pharmaceuticals, where again we had no experience when we started, and my job was to recruit the people with the expertise and build the practice group. So we diversified,
right,
like a good mutual fund.
Right. So what were some of the are there movies that you worked on? And again, this is obviously on the business and the financing side of movie making. But are there movies that you worked on that our listeners would be familiar with? I know you had an affiliation with Lionsgate for a number of years.
Yeah. So I sat on the board of I helped build Lionsgate as their outside advisor for about 10 years, and eventually I joined. I worked with them for about 14 years, spent about 10 years on the board, and I still remember the day we were sitting in the boardroom, and this movie was presented to us as being a movie they thought might do well, because it was based on a book that seemed to be doing well at this time, and it was called The Hunger Games.
Oh my goodness!
But I can tell you, on the other side of that decision, it was one of those. Well, we hope it works.
Yeah. Wow.
And it turned out to be the franchise that that certainly helped build the company up for quite a long period of time. So that would probably be the most famous one.
Right.
The other one that I was involved in financing was a movie called My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Sure.
And again,
that built a franchise too.
When our investors went into that one, they didn't even know what it was.
Yeah.
Like it was a throw-in deal as an investment. They were investing in some other film. I think it was called Harvard Man, which probably no one has ever seen, and it's a terrible movie. But they were investing in these two pictures, and of course, that one happened to be the right horse. And of all the movies I have ever been involved in financing, that is still number one. And from a Canadian perspective, the other one, again, a movie people may or may not have heard of, and this was right back to the beginning of my career in the early '80s, was a movie called Porky's.
Sure.
Terrible movie that did just incredible numbers at the box office.
Well, I'd imagine from a financing standpoint, it's easy to see certain movies that come in with the blockbuster label already on them because of the amount of money that they're going to spend. Or, I mean, we have all these Marvel movies now, which are just made to make gobs of money. But I imagine it must be pretty thrilling when you find, sort of a diamond in the rough, something that wouldn't be expected to be big, but becomes big, like Hunger Games or my.
You just never know. I was down in LA once, and we were meeting with the former head. I'm pretty sure it was Universal Pictures. His name was Tom Pollock, also a former lawyer. And I asked him, so what's the secret of your success? He said, listen, you shouldn't be asking me that question, because I'm the guy that said absolutely no to Forrest Gump and absolutely yes to Waterworld, because it was coming off a series of blockbusters.
Waterworld is one of the most famous duds that
exactly.
annals of Hollywood.
So so when people tell you, and I don't know if you've heard it, but if people ever tell you nobody knows what's going to work, it's because nobody knows.
Well, but it also from a law standpoint, from a lawyering standpoint, it also shows that as lawyers, and we do have a lot of lawyers and law students who listen to this program, if you're interested in entertainment or music or movies and you're not necessarily the person who's going to be at the front of the stage, there's still a way to be involved and have a lot of exciting work to do with making entertainment projects become successful. And I mean, I imagine you don't have as many actor stories to tell as you said, but to be part of those projects must have been pretty exciting. I would think, to watch them grow.
It was, and yeah, and going down to the Warner Brothers lot 4 or 5 times a year, and had some, and still have some very good friends in the executive suite. Most of them from the legal and finance department, who became over time became very close friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't give I like to say in some respects I've been blessed with the career I've had.
It's great.
It's such an interesting industry with such interesting characters in it.
Yeah.
And if you can find a way to make yourself relevant as an advisor, it's really not like any other business.
Well, interesting characters is a good segue for us into the story of Odell, the lead character, or the main character in your novel. And this is your first novel, is that right, Norman?
This is my first novel, and although I have written a second, we can get into that later, and I'm working on a third, and I'm also working on a second nonfiction. But back to Odell.
Yeah. So, okay. So, I mean, there's all kinds of questions I have about the writing process, as I mentioned, but how, well, I guess I should have you give, the 30-second elevator speech on what the story is about, again, without giving away any spoilers. So tell us about the story and how you came to it, I guess.
All right. Well, I came to it literally from Othello. So I read the play. I've probably read it now 25 times. And it's interesting because the person with the most lines in the play actually isn't Othello. It's the villain Iago.
Yeah.
Who's a fascinating character study and a sociopath. But the story, Othello's story, which actually isn't mine, but Othello's story is for those who don't really follow it, is about you have an African general who I've reset as an African American, who is in some respect an outcast in Italian society, who falls madly in love with a white Italian woman. They go off and elope, and bad things start happening to him, all at the hand of his lieutenant, who he has come to trust, whose name is Iago. So that was the starting point for my book. So I've got Odell, who has basically a lieutenant who works on all his deals. His name is Jackson Sherman, a boy from the South, and Odell has just eloped with Desdemona, whose name in the book is Dee, and against the wishes of her father, an Alabama senator, who, and I leave open the question of just how bigoted he may or may not be, but one thing for sure is in upper class society in Alabama, this kind of marriage just doesn't happen.
Right.
At least in the book. And so Dee has broken the code, and they go off to live in New York. And lo and behold, bad things start happening to Odell.
Right.
So
And
the question
his
Mhm.
nickname actually is the General. So that's another
That's correct.
from the Othello story.
Yes. So I tried as much as I could with the cast. So I basically took the entire cast or most of the cast of Othello, reset them in Manhattan, changed their names a little bit, tried to keep uh, their rules similar to what their rules were in the play, and in fact lifted partial scenes right out of the play and reset them. I can remember one where I reset it in a Manhattan restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where literally the characters are having a conversation and thought processes similar to what when basically borrowed from the play and reset in a modern context. But about midway through the book takes an extraordinary right turn, and that's when it becomes a murder mystery.
Mm.
And the second half of the book is devoted uh, to who done it.
Yeah.
And Odell's not sure uh, because he suffers periodic blackouts, just has no idea where he was on the night of the murder. And Odell's fall represents his fall from grace. And the question is, did he do it? And if he didn't, can he ever figure out the root of the blackouts?
Well, I can tell you, I'm halfway through the story, and there are a number of references already to uh, some very deep, dark secrets that Odell is carrying around with him, and I still don't know what they are. So the suspense, the suspense definitely carries, and a lot of passion, a lot of intrigue, and as you said, some kind of sinister goings on that have to unravel that still haven't unraveled. But it's I also find it fascinating that there is this track record for stories centered around lawyers, centered even around lawyers and law firms, and stories that are thrillers uh, in one way or another. Um, so, yes, you've obviously drawn from the Shakespearean uh, tradition, but also from a modern tradition of, as I say, stories built around the law and lawyers and law firm intrigue. What, having worked in law firms and worked around lawyers as you have, from being a young lawyer all the way up to a firm leader, and going through the process of this book and the other writing you're doing, what do you think it is about the law and lawyers that gives that provides such a suitable stage for this kind of story?
It's it's a good question, and in some respects, my book is a little bit different than your standard lawyer fare because most lawyer books are involve criminal lawyers
Mm-hmm.
in
Yep.
cases they're involved in, and then and they're working sometimes with the police, sometimes without the police, in terms of dealing with those issues. This is one of the few where you're actually dealing with commercial lawyers, and you get to see the inside of how the inside of a boardroom actually works, what goes on behind the scenes on large corporate deals. Not that this is a big part of the book, but I thought it was an interesting opportunity to open the curtain on that. But the reality is,
Mm-hmm.
lawyers, it's somewhat like doctors. Uh, they work in areas um, that aren't accessible to your average reader or your average viewer, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore they are quite open for dramatization. Um, and you can make them. In fact, I like to tell this to lawyers when I'm training them. It's uh, the law on television is far more glorified than what real life is, which is practice is actually fairly boring. But
Mm-hmm.
if you can put in the colorful characters who you know, and that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to give the readers an idea of what lawyers are actually like. Um, because they're like doctors. They tend to be remote and put up on pedestals. And when you can show readers that they're just, we're just like you,
Mm-hmm.
with the same weaknesses and strengths, and are, as a writer, you can play with the reality a little bit to make it a little more exciting than it might actually be in real life. Although you really can't say that anymore, because the truth of what we're living is almost unimaginable.
Well, the truth of what we're living right now, you mean?
What we're living right now, but
yeah,
that's why you look at the exceptions, and maybe this is an exceptional blip in time, but you can't make this stuff up. Or if you did, anyone would say, no, that's just complete fiction. So the idea, I think, from an author's perspective, is to try and transport readers away from their ordinary lives, but at the same time, making it obvious to them that these heroes in heroic situations, in a lot of respects, aren't any different than they are.
Mm-hmm. Heroes and villains. I mean, there's a pretty strong villain character in this story, and
yes.
At the beginning, it could just be one of any number of young lawyers trying to make it in a big law firm, and that would describe a lot of people, a lot of real people out there.
And really, what I was trying to play with is what happens when you take someone who has a personality that is, I will do anything I need to do to succeed, and just push them slightly towards the edge.
Mm-hmm.
How far will they go to succeed? And you can probably think of a lot of people that and certainly I got an email yesterday from a former associate saying, I know who all those characters are. And I'm thinking, I made them all up. and he's thinking, no, they all came from our law firm.
Well, that's interesting, actually, and what about that then? Because maybe they did, and you just weren't completely conscious of
Quite
it.
Possible.
Writing.
A couple of characters, I definitely plucked little pieces of them from reality, and if you look at the other thing is, particularly when you look at my evil character, in some respects, and I'm sure other authors feel the same way, he is a bit of an embodiment of all the things I can't say out loud.
Uh-huh.
So if I'm having a politically incorrect thought, I know I can't say it, but Jackson can say it.
Well, it's interesting because I've heard actors who've been interviewed say at times that they like playing the dark characters, the bad guy characters, the evil characters, sometimes more than they like playing the good guy characters. And I wonder if it's similar in that way, that you get to say things or explore dark sides of things that you would never want to show in your real self.
Yeah, and that's right. We all have thoughts like that sometimes, and we all have simple pleasures. And part of the writing process for me, and what I thought was really important, that once I started understanding how to write fiction, and that's a whole other story. But once I figured that out, it became clear to me that it was really important to make sure that sometimes good things happen to bad people, but sometimes bad things happen to bad people that they don't deserve. But as a reader, what I want is for you to feel really happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's being investigated, really, and as a reader, in your heart of hearts, this person cannot possibly have done it. But I want you sitting there thinking, but I hope they put him in jail anyways. Let him rot.
Well, you said it's another story, but let me ask the question to hear that story. I don't know what most people imagine when they think of a tax lawyer, but you alluded to it, and I think it's probably fair to say it takes a certain person who can spend hours poring over the nuances and intricacies of a mammoth code, the tax code, and build their career on that. not exactly the same person you'd associate with creative writing. I mean, there's just not a lot of creative writing in tax law.
I certainly would have said that.
Yeah.
Now, I spent my career as a tax planner, and as a tax planner, you read the code and you try and figure out where the loopholes are and how to get around and through and over and under the provisions that are trying to stop you from achieving your objective. And the truly great ones are able to build their careers finding those little cracks in the wall and blowing them wide open. And it requires a lot of patience, a lot of hitting your head against that wall until you have that moment when you finally get clarity and you know exactly what you're going to do. And in that respect, the writing process is exactly the same.
Well, that's fascinating.
And I'll sit there and I've got a story. Literally, it's about, to me, fiction is about solving problems. So I put two characters in a situation. I have I know how I want the scene to begin. I know how it's going to end. I don't have any idea of what's going to happen when these two people start thinking and talking to one another. And I can go sometimes days, weeks, months without being able to figure out the important thing that happens between them, and then until the light bulb goes off. And sometimes the light bulb will go off, and I'll be 100 pages down the road, and I say, and this is exactly what happened in Odell. I sat down about a third of the way through. I wrote the murder scene. I decided, okay, I've just decided who's going to die, and I've decided who's going to do it. And then I had to ask myself, okay, and how does it play out? I had one of the characters do something quite peculiar, and you may have read it already. But I then had to go back and rewrite the entire first half of the book.
Interesting.
So that action. Yeah. So as a reader, you'd say, "Oh yes, that's exactly what that character would do in that circumstance."
Right. Interesting. Well, that's fascinating. So yeah, I mean, sometimes you'd imagine you start from the beginning and you just start writing until you get to the end, but you're saying you actually at some point had to write some scene from the middle and then go back and work your way back to that point from the beginning.
Yeah, I've been to writers' conferences. Some writers will actually storyboard their entire book before they pick up a pencil to write it. And but that I were so disciplined. I'm the complete other end of the spectrum. I know how my story begins. I know how my story ends, at least when I start. But everything is open. So if I need to change my ending, I'm going to change my ending. And I find knowing where the story starts is one of the great challenges of the book. So first I write it, and then I figure out how it starts, as opposed to vice versa.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I can tell you that opening scene I flip-flopped over 25 times. Where do I start this book?
Yeah.
And it was funny. Originally, that page 1 at one point in time was page 42.
Well, yeah, I would think with a nonfiction book, it would be a lot easier to, as you say, storyboard or just have a detailed outline, and then just sit and start working away. Chapter 1, but with more. Not that there isn't creative writing in nonfiction, of course there is, but in imaginative writing and novel writing, I could see that it would, different people would approach things differently in the process. Were there ways that you were writing even when you weren't actually sitting down physically writing? I mean, were there things that you would do to help you get the creative juices going, or would things come to you just at odd moments, and were those light bulb moments more random?
I had it's interesting. I was working on a deal with Warner Brothers. This goes back to 2001, and there was a last-minute tax code change in Canada that pretty much blew the whole deal up. And we were looking, and my clients were looking at losses in the multiple millions of dollars. That's how serious it was. And I was so I decided I had to figure out a fix. But had no idea what it was, and literally I spent a week thinking about it, getting nowhere. And then I was sitting in the bathtub, and the light bulb went off, and like I couldn't get out of that bathtub fast enough. But I saw, I don't know where it came from, what part of my head it came from, but I saw the solution, and it was something that I had an idea that I'd had 10 years ago, and I just saw in just a sudden flash how it worked. And I have to say the writing process is exactly the same. Normally for me, I go out and walk the dog. If I'm having a block, I'll go out and walk the dog. But sometimes it will take, particularly as I'm earlier in the story, those blocks can sometimes be a week. They can be a month. They can be, sometimes I have to put the entire story away for 3 months and just come back to it. And suddenly I don't know where it comes from, but my brain, while I wasn't thinking about it, has at least given me an idea to work on. So I have no idea where it comes from. I still, and it's interesting because for me, the moments I live for as a writer are those moments where I'm writing a scene. And as I said, I'm not sure what the details are of the scene is, but I ask myself a question, is the relationship between these two characters tense enough? And I'll start writing, and then all of a sudden, I'm not in control of the typewriter anymore, like the keyboard. It's the characters are speaking. I'm just recording what they're saying. I'm not thinking about it anymore.
Yeah.
And I can remember, and this is now in scene 2 of the book, where I look down at the page, and this is on the final draft. Okay, this was not there until I almost went to publication, and I looked down at the page, and I just read it, and it was a secret that one character reveals to another, and I said, I had no idea.
Wow.
But it makes so much sense, and there it was in front of me.
That's great. Well, that's the characters really, having life to them, that they almost have a life. I mean, you've created them, but they kind of take on a life. And I think good writing, exciting writing, a great story with great characters has to have characters like that, or they're just flat. So if you've breathed life
and they all have
them,
to be different.
yeah, I mean, if you breathe life into them in a sense, and off they go. I mean, that's the ultimate proof that they're great characters with a real life to them, I think.
Yeah, but to your, to all the lawyers out there who may be listening to this, I will have to admit that, and I had no idea at the time, but when I started writing the fiction, I figured, okay, I've written a nonfiction, I know how to write a book, and I started writing it. I sent it off to, when I thought it was an acceptable draft, I sent it to the woman who edited Breakdown, which was my first book, and she got on the phone with me in an hour and a half, and the call began with, listen, it's an interesting story, and if you're satisfied being an amateur author, this is perfectly acceptable. And of course, after I picked myself off the floor, it was like the dagger going right through my chest.
Yeah.
She then directed me to all kinds of theory on writing fiction that I needed to start studying in order to improve it, because the book, the first draft of that book was horrible and unenlightened, and there were just so many things I did not know about fiction, and I'm bringing it back now to the lawyer side of things, and I look at it now, and I say, at the time I was probably I knew no more than an articling student. Pretty much in my first year out of law school, thinking I knew something about the law, and discovering I really knew nothing about the practice of law. Yeah. And in the 4.5 years or 5 years now I've been at it, I finally feel like I'm just making partner.
That's fun. Great.
All right, I get it. I get it, and I can still see I have so much more to learn.
Well, you're lucky you're lucky you had an editor who pushed you like that, because I mean, things that I've learned over the years as a journalist, a writer, and in my writing as a lawyer, There's no question, and I've tried to pass this lesson on to my kids. They'll bring me an essay, and I'll say, it's good, but let me see what you do with the second draft. And they're like, what? The second draft? You mean it's not perfect the way it just came out the first one? No, it's good writing. I think always needs good editing. So
yeah,
that's a good lesson for people too in the process. But as a lawyer, we're used to that. I mean, it's very rare that anything you do as a lawyer comes out perfect, finished, exactly the way you'd want it in the first round or in the first draft. There's always ways things can be made better. And figuring out how to do that, I mean, that's something lawyers do learn how to do. You have to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
So
it's obsessively rewrite.
Yeah.
But although I did find that the more involved I became in management and leadership, the shorter my attention span got, the less writing I was doing, and more. Even on my own transactions, I ended up having two younger partners who pretty much inherited the practice and did all the work, and I'd just be there for client contact and review. So I going back 5 or 6 years, it had been a long time since I had to really obsess over getting every word right on something I was writing. So it's like a complete career restart from the beginning.
But still, as you said, building on things that you had learned as a lawyer. I mean, just patience, painstaking attention to detail, giving yourself time and space for solutions to problems to come through. Just like I've always thought about math, which I wasn't particularly good at. Sometimes you just stare at the problem long enough. You're not even necessarily doing anything. You're just allowing the brain to focus on it and give it time to stew on something, and the way through the problem will come to you. That takes patience, and especially in these times, 140 characters and all. We don't have that kind of patience.
No, patience, resilience, and just the notion that you're just not going to give up until you're finished, and until you're satisfied with it. And I'm at that stage in life where I can afford to do that, and thank God I don't have to make a living doing that. I do it for the love of it, and that's the one thing I discovered that I would not have guessed, and that's that I love doing this. So that makes it all the more something that's incredibly difficult. I won't say all the more easy, because in fact it isn't easy at all. And if it was easy, I'd probably stop doing it.
Well, what are some of the other things that you're working on now? I know you mentioned you had a couple of other novels. You have a nonfiction project.
So I decided that Odell was going to be the beginning of a series. So I decided the second to pick up. So I did the exact same thing with Hamlet, and I reset Hamlet as the failing drug-addicted son of an American industrialist who's built this huge generic pharmaceutical empire, and he himself is an immigrant who believes he's done it all himself. The book is called right now. It's called The Ophelia Project, because I decided that the focus characters in the book are the heroes are women. I decided the Hamlet character is just going through the play. He's just Shakespeare, as my wife always says to me, Shakespeare could get away with this. You can't. And
not yet.
Not yet. Hopefully one day.
Right.
Hopefully one day. And it actually links. The story links two families from a dramatic boat trip across the channel from Denmark to Sweden in 1943. So it's about a Lutheran fishing family who saves a Jewish family, and this is part of the actual boat lift that happened in September 1943, from where over 7,000 Jews were able to escape Nazi-occupied Denmark and were brought over by heroic fishermen. So the story is about the two 12-year-old boys on that boat. One is the son of the fisherman who becomes the business magnate, and the other is the son of a Jewish diamond merchant. Something extraordinary happens on that boat ride that links the families forever, but where only one of the families is aware of it.
Wow. And what is the title of that? The Ophelia Project?
That book, that is called The Ophelia Project.
And is that out yet or coming out?
No, that should be out in the, well, now now with everything going on in the world, I'm not sure when. It was originally scheduled for late fall, but we may put it up to early next year. And the book is a little bit more complicated. It's also murder mystery, more dead bodies. I use the same police detectives will be reappearing, and it gives me a chance to tell the history of the law firm that is one of the characters in Odell's Fall. So it's the same characters, but much earlier in their career. And Odell makes a cameo appearance in that one as well. So I'm building this into a series.
That's fantastic. That's really exciting. What is it? I mean, you've turned in the manuscript. You're waiting for it to come out. Is that hard, the waiting, or is your attention so focused on the next thing that you're not even thinking about it too much?
Well, it's interesting. It's the problem when I wait too long on a project is I sit down and reopen it.
Yeah.
And it's funny because originally the title was revolved around the Hamlet character, and it was sort of I put it in the drawer for 3 months after my agent is now trying to shop it, and sort of the light bulb went off as to who the true hero of the story was, and I said, okay, the book isn't going to be about Hamlet. The book is going to be centered around Ophelia.
Yeah.
And so I rewrote a scene early in the book, and I had to beef up the end of the book because now with the refocus on Ophelia, there wasn't enough meat about her at the end of the book. And when I wrote one of the penultimate chapters, it occurred to me exactly what the name of the book had to be and why.
Wow.
And so that's the problem when you have too long to sit on it. And the same thing happened with Odell. We were what I thought was final draft, and one of the editors called me and said, I don't really like Odell, and I don't really like D. And again, another moment where a different editor, this one was the publisher's editor. So she said, you can live with it if you want, but I just can't connect with them.
Well, and again, I mean, it's such a great lesson for anybody who does any kind of writing. It's so hard to, when you've reached the end, you've completed the draft of whatever the thing is, and then to have to think about getting yourself together with the energy required to jump back into it for round 2 for the second draft. It's so hard to do, but I mean, as you've now said a couple of times, if you were to look back at your first drafts after having gone through the many, many rewrites that it takes to get to the end, I mean, I bet you probably wouldn't even want your name on that first draft anymore.
I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah, I mean, that's
how bad it is.
Right. That's how it's almost always, if not always, better when you've gone through all those steps, whether it's a novel or presentation or whatever it is.
And the other thing I find is when I'm doing the scene rewrites at the end, the characters, I know them inside out, so I can write the scenes much faster, and I know when I've got the right idea, I know it immediately, and I know the 14 places in the book that I have to go back into to adjust.
Right.
And when you're finished this read, call me and I'll tell you what I changed. But there's nobody now that picks up this book that doesn't feel a deep connection to both of the leading characters.
Yeah. Well, and I'll look forward to the next one too. Odell's Fall is the name of the book. I'm just looking at the squib from the former president of HBO Pictures, who calls it a page-turning potboiler, and it's true. I read a ton, as the people who listen to this podcast know, and I'm really enjoying the book, and we'll look forward to the Ophelia Project when it comes out as well. Norman, you have a website, I think, right? People can go to your website.
You can go if you want to find more about it, or read the first 3 chapters just to see if you're going to like it. You go to normanbacal.com. That's Norman Bacal, one word, .com. Pretty simple, and you can also pick up the book on Amazon. And it is now, as of yesterday. As of last night, I loaded it onto iBooks as well. So. Oh,
fantastic! Well, we're going to put a link, obviously, to probably to the Amazon site, so people can buy them that way. Is there any chance this is going to get turned into a movie?
It's interesting. I sent the book down to all my friends at Lionsgate.
Yeah,
I really copies at the film festival, but nobody has called yet. But I'm waiting. Just if anybody in the film business wants to read it and make it into a movie.
I think it would be.
Just get in touch with me.
I think it would be a fantastic movie. I'm putting my vote in for that. Norman Bacal, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It was a pleasure to get to know you and to talk with you.
Aaron, thanks. It's been my pleasure.